Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, as the techs transferred chlorine, a rain bomb released a fresh toxic cloud, sending the western roadblock scrambling to safety. Meanwhile, officials sought to control open questions during the public evacuee meetings. We now continue with Part 1 and the conclusion of Chapter 19. Two Fronts. April 18. As the second week of evacuation began, MRL's Dan Watts declared at the 7 a.m. briefing, Tank Car 3 is still a very dangerous situation out at the worksite. Do not get complacent. But residents continued to visit the exclusion zone. During an escort, Deputy Howard Reed noted, we located Fat Albert, the cat of 5th Street, and left 2 pounds of food for him. Fat Albert belonged to everyone and no one. Again, left behind. Officials hashed out worst-case scenarios at an IC meeting. Waldron, in the case of a catastrophic incident, to be blunt, it would be a recovery operation, not rescue. The techs agreed. A worst-case scenario for Car 3 entailed a large amount spilling out, or another catastrophic release if the tank blew a patch while under pressure. Another scenario was a large spill during or followed by a rain. A massive cloud would quickly form. Weiss recalled, we were brainstorming all kinds of things. Okay, this is really bad. How could it possibly get worse? There was also concern of more chlorine coming into contact with the cressolate. Weiss, the worst case scenario was, say, the tanker car rolling a little bit, becoming unbalanced, rolling and spilling chlorine into that big puddle of cressolate and causing a hyperreactive fire or explosion, and thereby releasing not only acid gas, but heated volatilized organic chlorines. But that was the worst-case scenario that many residents later feared had initially happened on April 11. By mid-afternoon, cars 1 and 2 were cleared from Car 3 and repositioned nearby and leveled. Marine Environmental noted at 12:45 p.m., hydrochloric acid cloud drifting south, greater than 100 parts per million, the limit of this meter. Cloud drifting to Plateau Road happened while moving Car 2. During one day of spikes, MRL Section Foreman Gordon Hendrick received his first direct exposure. The western roadblock had been moved back to Fish Creek, and Hendrick's crew was working to the east on a high trestle bridge. They had B&B working out there the whole time, he said, building and bridges. And of course, they had the whole area blocked off to where nobody was supposed to be working there at all. Hendrick's crew and the bridge builders numbered about 15. At the site, he said, they were trying to unload the cars and stuff, and one of them sprang a leak or something. The smell was so bad. We thought, man, we're getting the hell out of here. We got evacuated off the bridge because it had changed directions, and it was burning our sinuses and stuff like that. When we came back out, we went by the roadblock, and they stopped us, and they said, man, you guys aren't supposed to be nowhere near that. As chlorine gas arrived, Hendrick said, it was kind of like a fog moved in. You could see it moving in on us. Hendrick coughed and had a burning throat and sinuses. It was very uncomfortable, he said. Others complained too. A lot of them did. Some of them it didn't bother at all. Despite the exposure and being in the exclusion zone, we were back out to work the next day, on the bridge again, Hendrick said. The afternoon of April 18, people packed the evacuee meeting room, many standing against the walls. Watts announced work on Car 3 would begin tomorrow, steam heating the chlorine to make vapor. The meat of the agenda arrived as Ellen Leahy stepped to the podium. As for limiting questions at meetings, Leahy said, I got good feedback that format went well yesterday. I did want to address a question that keeps going around, and that has to do with what people are smelling in Alberton. How many have re-entered the Alberton town site, she asked, and how many people of those smelled something? Several hands rose. What I want to let you know is that we believe you. We absolutely believe that you smell something. But because we don't yet have an answer and the questions we've asked have turned up nothing, I don't want you to think that we're just going to wait for the smell to come up and introduce itself to us. We're working with a chemist, an environmental chemist at the University of Montana by the name of Dr. Garen Smith, and he's generating some hypotheses for us. We're working with Chris Weiss of the EPA. We're talking to Dr. Dart down at the Poison Control Center to try and see what we might be able to find out about this smell. And that gets into some other issues. The potassium cressolate at the site. Leahy said the DEQ, EPA, and the Health Department would all assist in the process to determine what level of cleanup is necessary. On day 8, Leahy acknowledged and believed residents' reports of a smell during visits, though she didn't mention associated symptoms. She promised to investigate. "We're not letting go of that," she said. Peter Nielsen of the Health Department added an update on monitoring outside the exclusion zone. "At this particular time, there's not any significant release of chlorine from the tanker," he said. "We're getting 0 readings pretty consistently." Nielsen seemed unaware of the consistent spikes the last few days and the occasional positive readings outside the exclusion zone. As Ellen pointed out, he said, "We do have concerns about the interactions of the chlorine with the other chemicals that were released. But we'll keep doing this chlorine monitoring as people move back in." Someone in the audience asked, "Was there a reading at SEER?" Waldron: "I can comment on SEER." The public had not been informed about the chlorine spikes 2 days prior that had pushed back the SEER roadblock. Not surprisingly, rumors had spread. Waldron now elaborated, a little. "When the wind came through," he said, "they did have the roadblock over by SEER, they got some readings. We sent the hazmat tech team out and they drove the whole area. And I think we got just one little bump there during that windstorm." Waldron kept touching behind his ear as if nervous. "And I don't recall how high, and just for a very short period of time," he said. This was the first public mention of readings at SEER from that day. Weiss elaborated, "There were a few hits at that station out there, spikes. It's due to the fact that chlorine in the evening, when the wind picks up out there and spins around a little bit, it sends puffs of chlorine through that area. They are very short-term spikes. They are not all that high." These explanations downplayed April 16th's hours-long spikes greatly and did not relate them to the rainfalls. The public had no idea of the interplay between rain and chlorine spikes and the unpredictability of fresh releases. They might want to know if rain were predicted during the window of a given animal visit. Weiss said the roadblock was now safe, relocated miles further to the west. No one questioned why the east roadblock and exclusion zone boundary in the direction of prevailing winds was left much closer to the site. Leahy interjected, "We can answer specific questions, again, at the end of the meeting. Thanks." The message: this was not the time to ask such specific questions, and so the incident at SEER would not be publicly discussed again, even though it clearly held general interest. The health department didn't seem to know much about the spikes, and the panel effectively shut the topic down. Without this resident's open question, it seemed unlikely there would have been any public discussion at all about SEER spikes and the pullback. Officials then announced that residents could again visit the exclusion zone the next day. Unpredictable chlorine spikes aside, even though Leahy acknowledged that visitors had been smelling something, that officials heard from some people of reactions to visiting, that investigation into compounds from a possible chlorine cressolate reaction had just begun, and though officials had begun to recognize hypersensitivity, they continued to allow people into the exclusion zone. Leahy was clearly aware at the time and made no public objections. Then, surprisingly, Q&A was allowed again. The floodgates opened. A blonde woman at the mic stand: "In our houses, there is a residual powder. Is anybody doing any testing on that? It's covering everything in our home." This was the first public mention of the infamous white powder, which Lucinda Hodges and many others noticed. Adjacent young woman: "And could they be personal tests? Also, personal tests where we could be there?" Blonde: "Yes." Young woman: "When you're doing our soil test and our air test, we can have more than one?" Someone at the podium asked, "Where do you live?" Blonde: "Downtown Alberton." She was told to speak to someone after the meeting. Young woman: "Why can't this be public? This needs to be public." She wasn't angry, but assertive. People talked over each other. Peter Nielsen: "I'll talk with you after the meeting. We are concerned with the interaction of the chlorine with regard to the other chemicals that were released, and we do think that needs to be evaluated." The young woman asked Leahy, "You mentioned that you do not always have all the monitoring devices that you need for air samples. I was wondering, when are you going to get those tools?" Nielsen answered, "We had a problem yesterday with chlorine monitors. I'm not that concerned with chlorine outside the exclusion zone at this time." Young woman: "I am." Nielsen: "We've heard comments and remarks about the herbicide smell, And again, that's not chlorine. So if something else is there, it hasn't been evaluated yet. As more questions came about chlorine, Nielsen emphasized, outside the exclusion zone where people are being let in, we just don't see any chlorine at this point. Visitors came into the exclusion zone, but officials dismissed chlorine as an explanation for reports of smells and symptoms upon these visits. A woman who visited Sears said, I was in there for 20 minutes. The smell was very, very bad. A very bad smell, like so bad I felt like I needed to run because I was so panicked that the smell was so bad. Another woman asked, has anybody working in the area that wasn't sensitized to it at first, a non-Alberton resident, have they complained about the smell as they go over the 9-mile hill or go into the valley? Or is it just the Alberton residents that have returned that are still smelling it? Her question related to sensitivity, but its significance seemed lost on the panel. Paris Young wanted to know more about the caustic solution. I'm really interested if there were chemical interactions on the site and if we have synergistic results or products, and particularly in relation to the precipitant people have been talking about. Watts said of the potassium cresslate, we have a sample of it and it's being analyzed. Southside Road resident Jeff Stiles also asked about the spent caustic. Could you explain to the people what spent means? Little had been explained about the cresslate. Chris Weiss, we've been looking into the source of the potassium cresslate. The material is used to remove impurities from gasoline. The main impurity is a compound called mercaptan. Mercaptan is a sulfur-bearing compound that has a very foul odor. It smells like very, very rotten cabbage. When the material is loaded with mercaptans and is no longer effective in extracting that mercaptan, it's neutralized with a very basic solution, a caustic solution, like potassium hydroxide. As far as I know, Weiss said, we do now have a sample of the material that was in the car, so we will have some idea of the reactions that may have occurred with that material. As you heard Ellen say, the county is working very hard with the university, and we have a mass spectrometer, which is a very sensitive analytical instrument, and we're going to be looking into the complexity of the chemistry of that material. I agree with Ellen. We do understand that you are smelling something out there, and we believe it may be associated with the cresslate. To date, this was a singular statement. We plan to keep you informed as we know more, Weiss said, and if you have any questions, we'll answer them to the extent that we can. None of this information had been forthcoming without open questions. A man in a ball cap asked, on Saturday evening, a rail link official and an official from Fire Station 5 took my wife and I into the hot zone area. We lived directly above where the spill was on Plateau Road. Some of the trees were browning, some of the foliage was browning there, and I want to know if you have any information about that. What's going on there? There was a heavy smell, and her eyes were burning as of Saturday night going in. He and his wife should not have been allowed into the hot zone unprotected. Residents had been generally told the vegetation was undamaged. Alan Stein answered, we have hired a vegetative specialist company. Bitterroot Restoration is coming in, and they are evaluating impacts to the vegetation in the area. That information will be available as we obtain it. Ballcap man. Also, what are the levels at the spill site? Chlorine and the other chemicals, what are the actual levels there? I mean, you said there's samples being taken all around the area. What about at the site? Weiss returned to the podium and referred to a chlorine reading data sheet. We've seen hits at the high end up around 60, he said. The logs had reflected readings up to 128 parts per million. Ballcap man, I'd like to know what the actual reading was when you first arrived at the site. Weiss, MRL has some of the best modelers in the country. People who, based upon evidence at the site, for example, the size of the hole in the chlorine car and the pressure in the car and the temperature at the time and the meteorological conditions, will be trying to predict mathematically exactly what those concentrations were. After a woman asked Leahy a health question, Roger Chalmers said, we need some doctors here to answer our questions. Leahy, there have been doctors brought in. I think you all have a different preference on what type of doctor or what kind of healthcare provider that you would choose, and you certainly are free to make that choice. And we can certainly try to line you up with other physicians, but I think that gets down to an individual level and individual preference, and we'd be glad to help you with that. Woman, but I think the point was that has there been any other incidents like this where other doctors in other cities would know what's going on, where you can get that information? Leahy, we certainly talked with ATSDR about that and received some information. Weiss, as Ellen said, we have had physicians here. We also have access to toxicologists who do have experience in this field, out of Denver, and I did give you a number for them. Weiss was referring to poison control. We'll give you folks you can talk to, people who are trained clinical toxicologists. But no expert on chlorine exposure had presented at a public meeting. Will Snodgrass then spoke for a minute about the need for testing to include looking for organochlorines, both in the environment and the human body. Waldron interrupted Snodgrass. We've got experts and we're bringing in every expert in the world, and these people deserve their answers, and we're trying to give them, woman, wait a minute, I want to know about inaudible. Waldron, well that's fine, ma'am. If you could, the problem we have in answering those questions is we don't understand what you're telling us. Snodgrass, and all I'm saying here is that these are official EPA documents issued in August of 1994 pursuant to the rising concerns about chlorine and the formation of these chlorinated carbon-based compounds. Waldron agreed to make copies for distribution. Snodgrass, okay, that's fine. I think we're starting to move ahead then. Thank you very much. Applause. Officials closed the meeting as Snodgrass sat down, but people could ask questions of panel members afterwards. The complainers were back. Q&A had gone forward, but instead of statements of praise like yesterday, pent-up questions were unleashed. Following the 26-minute update, questions had lasted 30 minutes, despite intentions to steer people to post-meeting groups. People's questions on day 8 revealed a thirst for more information of general interest to all, such as, what happened at SEER? What is this white powder? Can we get our homes tested? What is the bad smell during visits? What's in potassium cresylate? Why are trees turning brown? Are non-exposed workers reacting to Alberton, not just sensitized people? What chlorine levels were we exposed to on day 1? Is there medical treatment we should be getting? Can we get chlorine medical experts to speak? Are we at risk to chlorine byproducts in our bodies and the environment? Most of these questions had yet to be fully addressed. But 2 key bits of information had been imparted today from the panel. Leahy had acknowledged that there was a smell in the Alberton area, promising to investigate, and Weiss said, we believe it may be associated with the cresylate. The meeting ended, but Snodgrass's camera kept rolling. Not everyone was happy with the Q&A. Off-camera frame, Waldron addressed Snodgrass. For you to sit here and say, we, and you don't live in Alberton, and to incite these people is unacceptable. Snodgrass later reflected, for someone to come up and make a statement like that, from my perspective, as the person providing the scientific information, independent of the interest of MRL, that is unacceptable for that person to do that. I was really being pushed and shoved from all directions. But Waldron seemed willing to disseminate information from Snodgrass. Fax me the stuff, he said, and that's all I ask. I'll get it to the right people at MRL and the health department, and everybody else, and we'll make copies. Snodgrass had offered the 13-page chemical summary for chlorine, prepared by the EPA in 1994, and information from the Chemical Injury Information Network. Snodgrass believed his effort encouraged people to ask questions, as well as confide in him. Scott Waldron and others told me, well, don't talk to these people anymore. They're getting upset, you know? Snodgrass recalled the environmental adage, polite people get poisoned. So the company line was being fed, he said. People, many of them bought it. Again, Alberton is sort of a railroad town. There were many people there who got angry, and a lot of people don't want to think that they're hurt. The bottom line is there is an incredible abundance of information about the effects of toxic chemicals upon the life design, and most of it is destructive. I think some of the material I had gotten was very adverse to the MRL damage control movement. Snodgrass was indeed ruffling feathers. After the meeting, Snodgrass interviewed Chris Weiss, who spoke softly and looked tired. He reiterated what he knew about the potassium cresylate. A phenolic compound, he said, used to extract mercaptans from gasoline. This was actually the first mention of phenols, which Weiss omitted during the meeting. Phenols had a pesticide-like smell and readily combined with chlorine. Weiss, there certainly was proximity between the chlorine and the cresylate. Both are reactive, and it's certainly plausible that when you have a strong base and chlorine, that those have reacted. We do recognize the plausibility of phenolic compounds, perhaps reaction products, entering the plume and moving through the air to off-site regions. and we're going to be looking for that. The chlorine is reactive, he said. It's certainly plausible, if not likely, that there may be some chlorine products that formed. That depends upon many things. That includes the temperature of the exothermic reaction that occurred there. Weiss had imparted new information that hadn't been discussed in public, that the cresslate and chlorine underwent an exothermic reaction, and that the cresslate contained phenols, which plausibly reacted with the chlorine to create compounds, chlorinated phenols, which might have migrated in a mixed plume. Like many others, Hodges felt in the dark about potassium cresslate. An MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet, for potassium cresslate solution, spent, was made publicly available about this time. By volume, the spent solution was 70 to 80% water, 10 to 20% potassium hydroxide, and 5 to 15% potassium cresslate, which contains dissolved creosols and phenols. And finally, less than 1% each of ethyl, methyl, and butyl mercaptans. Any remaining hazardous components, undefined, were present at less than 1%. Weiss said the cresslate was used to purify gasoline. Garen Smith said natural gas. And mercaptan components were extracted in the process. The spent cresslate was then mixed with potassium or sodium hydroxide to allow non-pressurized shipping. The MSDS listed health warnings for the solution, noting harmful or fatal if swallowed or inhaled, causes burns to skin and eyes, may cause blindness. Allergic sensitization of the skin may occur. With inhalation, the caustic fumes resulted in effects similar as from chlorine, upper and lower respiratory tract irritation and burns, coughing, constriction of the bronchus, pulmonary edema, pneumonitis, and death. Ingestion or inhalation could result in severe gastrointestinal symptoms, liver and kidney damage, and central nervous system damage. As with chlorine, people with pre-existing chronic respiratory illness may be at increased risk of aggravating respiratory disease. The MSDS also noted this material has not been tested as a whole for all potential health effects. It may have other health hazards related to its components. An unknown synergistic effect. Decontamination was essential. The corrosive solution carried a reactivity warning. May produce heat on contact with water. Avoid contact with acids, such as chlorine. The MSDS advised hazmat crews to wear level A protection. Unprotected workers at the Alberton site risk both chlorine and potassium cresslate exposure. The potassium cresslate solution was described as maybe dark red colored, oily in appearance, with a hydrocarbon or sulfurous odor. The sulfurous or rotten egg odor came from the captured mercaptans. As separate components, the potassium hydroxide and mercaptans had exposure limits roughly around 0.5 to 1 parts per million. No exposure limit had been established for the potassium cresslate component, or for the solution as a whole. The potassium cresslate component contained cresol, which had various names including methylphenol. As noted by the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center, the cresol odor was phenolic. Though not yet stated publicly during this incident, phenol smelled pesticide-like and also like medicine. On April 18, the Poison Control Center faxed the Health Department a bulletin regarding cresol. They noted cresol has a phenolic odor and its toxicity is similar to phenol, including severe burns to the skin and even systemic absorption affecting the heart. An MSDS for cresol elaborated. For acute health effects, it noted, skin or breathing exposure can cause rapid weakness, nausea, collapse, coma, and death. Contact can cause severe skin and eye burns. Lower or repeated exposures can cause poor appetite, headaches, dizziness, and personality changes. Chronic health effects can occur at some time after exposure and can last for months or years, and included liver and kidney damage and skin allergy. In sum, potassium cresslate solution spent was a soup of dangerous chemicals. 17,000 gallons had spilled from a rupture immediately adjacent to a ruptured tank of chlorine. Both the chlorine and potassium cresslate were extremely toxic, and officials had increasing concern that the two had reacted and possibly produced a mixed cloud, a chlorinated brew of toxic chemicals. Ellen Leahy noted on April 18, smell, cresol, and mercaptans. The cresol contained phenols which smelled like pesticides. By April 19, DEQ's Tom Ellerhoff noted, Several complaints from re-entry evacuees of pesticide smells. Also, white precipitate on furniture in houses. Enter Garen Smith. In the April 19 Missoulian, University of Montana chemistry professor Garen Smith announced that he would analyze soil and air samples from the site to look for any new compounds created by the combinations of chemicals spilled. The paper said Smith's analysis was instigated by evacuees returning from visits to the Alberton area reporting a pesticide smell that gave them headaches and made their eyes water. This was the first media report of visitors smelling a pesticide-like smell and having related symptoms. Smith suspected the Cresslate caused the pesticide odor and was the first person to publicly associate a pesticide smell with the Cresslate, though health officials had made an association in closed meetings. Smith warned that creosol was a toxic hazard to workers at the site, the first public indication that potassium cresslate was a health hazard. Smith later explained that potassium hydroxide alone is extremely caustic. That will change your skin to soap and it'll wash away, he said. The Missoulian continued. The unanswered question was whether chlorinated organics had formed when the Cresslate came in contact with the chlorine gas, a mixing now assumed. Smith also provided the first published insight into vegetation damage by a non-resident when he said fir trees within a mile of the derailment have already started to turn brown and yellow. It shouldn't have been a surprise that highly reactive chlorine had reacted with the Cresslate. In a chlorine release, chlorinated organics were natural byproducts. Organochlorines were almost universally toxic. In the immediate vicinity of the spill, Smith recalled, the richest source of organics for the chlorine to react with was the potassium Cresslate tanker. So when people started complaining about a pesticide-like smell and there was potassium Cresslate there and chlorine, I said, that probably makes sense. Furthermore, Smith said, a phenol chlorinated starts to smell like garden chemicals. Pesticide, fertilizer, weed and feed. Skunk-like mercaptans, a sulfur compound, were decidedly different. Many people can sense them at 0.5 parts per billion, Smith said. By the time you get to 30 parts per billion, 80% of the population can smell it. Potassium Cresslate stunk, and unlike anyone else associated with the response so far, Smith, the chemist, seemed to expect a reaction between the chlorine and the Cresslate, given the nature of the chemicals. With cars 1 and 2 pulled away, the techs finally assessed the rupture in car 3. They said they were pleased to see the hole was pretty much what they had expected. The hole is approximately 24 inches long and 3 inches wide. Apparently the techs had expected the largest ever breach in a chlorine tank. They wouldn't be pleased for long. There is old ice under the car, they said, which appears to have gone through a freeze-thaw-freeze cycle. The objective is to see if car 4 in the ditch can be pulled away from car 3 in order to patch car 3. The soil in the area is yellow and readings are about 100 parts per million. There is still concern about the north end. The north end of car 3 had plowed into the soil. The hole was at the south end near the bottom of the tank. Though the tank angled toward the north, most of the chlorine had escaped. A dirt berm with liquid nitrogen may not work. The plan is to proceed with the original patching plan for car 3, the tech said. If the patching is successful and there are no more leaks, the pressure should start rising immediately. They again hope to remove the chlorine as a liquid. At the IC night shift briefing, Watts elaborated. They're going to apply a rubber bladder, a strap, and patch the hole. Then pressurize the tank and pump out the liquid. It's a lot faster than applying heat. They would start tomorrow. Dow chemical specialists are optimistic it will work, he said. But this was new territory, attempting to patch the biggest hole ever in a chlorine tank and remove the chlorine as a liquid. If pressure built and the patch catastrophically failed, the site faced another flash burst. By the end of the busy day shift, cars 1, 2, and 4 each had around half of their loads transferred and could be moved and leveled. But the day wasn't done. At 7 p.m., Leahy heard from Garen Smith that chlorine and potassium Cresslate had indeed mixed to create chlorinated phenols. She informed Waldron, who asked, "What does this mean?" It meant the Alberton chemistry experiment was official. MRL enthusiastically logged at 8 p.m. Everything has been cleared around car 3. Now the techs could turn their attention fully to the tank when they weren't dodging chlorine releases. Just north of the site, double-digit peaks started before 9 p.m. At 10 p.m., MRL logged readings over 90 parts per million just beyond the North Zone barrier tape. Also at 10 p.m., a woman at Tarkio reported she smelled chlorine 11 miles west of the spill and 4 miles beyond the Fish Creek roadblock. Then at 11:35 p.m. came the highest spike reported during the Alberton incident, 1,448.7 parts per million by the river. Little other information was logged by MRL. Marine's log elaborated, noting readings were also verified by the appearance of a visible chlorine cloud in the same area. A monitor registered 20 parts per million by the time the cloud had traveled to I-90 about a quarter mile away. Twice the level immediately dangerous to life and health on the highway. On April 16, when gas spikes caused the retreat of the Sear roadblock, the highest log reading at the I-90 monitor was 2.4 parts per million. The deadly 1,448 parts per million spike was over 10 times higher than any other previous reading. No one logged any cause, but ice in the soil had been exposed during work. Rain did not appear to be a factor. Mountainous spikes continued throughout the night, like a series of aftershocks, despite no further soil disturbance. Spikes peaked dozens of times in double and triple digits. The marine fixed dosimeter on Reardon Lane, 100 feet from the tank, reported half-hour peak readings at the North Hot Zone barrier that included 821, 89, 92, 201, 54, 75, and 100 parts per million. The final peak was reported at 5:49 a.m. The time-weighted average between 9 p.m. April 18 and 6 a.m. April 19 was over 34 parts per million. A lethal, night-long chlorine bath. According to MRL, not much in the way of major spikes was detected at the other sites, they said. The drift went mainly north, and then where? Despite that spikes included the highest readings on record and lasted for around 9 hours, there was no log mention of tracking or modeling the fate of these severe releases. Of the 1,448 parts per million reading, Weiss recalled, "One breath of that would kill you." This was greater than the amount he had guessed had killed John Elmer Smith Jr. "I'm sure there were higher ones right near the worksite," he said. "I know that there were recorded a few, if not several, over 1,000, that we were monitoring. And that's essentially the rationale I used to keep the highway closed." Weiss said at the next day's evacuee meeting, "Last night, while there was some earth moving going on along out at the site, there was some extreme excursions. We had some spikes. The soil had chlorine in it, and when it was rolled over, that chlorine off-gassed." Weiss elaborated to the Missoulian that when workers pulled car 4 away from car 3, this movement released an extreme spike of chlorine gas trapped in the soil beneath tank 4. Well within what would be the lethal range, he said, about 1,400 parts per million. But the spikes had started an hour after MRL declared everything cleared, and the highest spike, followed by many more, came hours after that. Car 4 had come to a rest in the south ditch at a right angle to and touching car 3. Liquid chlorine had obviously spilled into the ditch, just adjacent an upgrade of the spilled potassium crestlate, and some had pooled and auto-refrigerated beneath car 4, waiting like a chlorine landmine ever since. This further suggested that significant liquid chlorine had likely mixed with the crestlate on April 11. By 7 a.m. of April 19, IC reported readings non-detect. Following the night of spikes, officials allowed residents to again visit the exclusion zone, even as they had yet to determine what does this mean that the chlorine had reacted with the crestlate. Had any compounds migrated? At least 39 people were admitted into the exclusion zone for animal care visits this day. Several positive readings turned up when off-site chlorine monitoring resumed, including east of Petty Creek. One day ended and another began on 2 worrisome notes: fresh spikes with the highest chlorine readings yet, and news that chlorine and potassium crestlate had created chlorinated compounds. Car 3 had yet to be touched. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, chemist Garen Smith and health officials determined the nature of chlorinated chemicals created in the mixing of chlorine and the potassium crestlate. This unwelcome news adds a new layer of concern for spill victims worried about their health and safety. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.